In this webinar, we'll introduce ourselves. When you give your introduction, please tell us your name and where you teach and what subject you teach. And then I'll introduce myself and I'll not only tell you a little bit about myself, I'll also tell you why we decided this would be a good webinar for CCCOnline faculty. The concepts we'll cover are systems theory, learning theories, and instructional design. And then at the end, we'll look at some learning objects. I've only gotten one submission from a webinar participant so far, so we'll look at that. And then we will also look at some learning objects that I've developed that fit into different categories. Ask me questions at any time. You can stop me. I haven't not given this webinar before, although the slides and the foundation for it were a presentation I have already given, but asynchronously. So stop me anytime, and I'd be happy to give you the PowerPoint afterwards. You'll notice in really fine print I cited literature, and I don't expect you to try to write that down while we're talking. All right, so let's start really broadly. What is instructional design? So Smith and Reagan define it as the systematic and reflective process of translating principles of learning and instruction into plans for instructional materials, activities, information resources, and evaluation. So let's make sure that we keep our brains really broad. Instructional design influences not only higher education, but all kinds of training in the corporate and military world, as well as in the educational world. Instructional design is based on systems theory. So the idea of systems theory is that there's a set of interrelated parts that work together to achieve a goal. So this challenges reductionism, and the idea of reductionism is that each part is significant and the system is no greater than the sum of its parts. But what we know from our professional experience is that the entire course delivers something more rich than one piece of the course. So a general system is inherently a closed one, which leads to stability. And the idea is that we teach 15-week sessions 3 times a year. We put in effort to prepare the course as online instructors. We run the course, we gather feedback, we make minor changes for improvement, and then we go through the process again. And this is a closed loop system, especially at CCCOnline where we have a master course. So if we want something to change or we find a mistake in the course shell, it usually is addressed by the time we enter the instructional period for the next semester. So how are instructional design and learning theory different? So we're going to cover both of these things, and they loosely can be characterized as, a theoretical foundation and then a practice. But it's really much more interrelated, especially at CCCOnline because we use instructional designers. So instructional designers have different degrees than we have. They have master's level degrees in instructional design, a discipline, whereas each of us has a terminal degree in the subject that we teach. We don't necessarily have any training in education theory or instructional design. We just do what is intuitive for us. So we tend to understand the content and we understand learner characteristics based on our intuitions, but not necessarily based on some theoretical foundation. So instructional designers are guided by learning theory, and it helps them to understand how the mind of the learner works. We promote learning in our classrooms by working with IDs who know how systems work. Now, I have the analogy here of a house. we have an interior designer and an engineer. It's important that the house is both structurally sound, but it also has to be appealing and it has to be a comfortable place. And so we need our students to not only uh, learn, we need them to appreciate their learning experience because we know that adult learners are highly motivated from the inside. They're intrinsically motivated, unlike youthful learners who really look to authority for validation. So there are three prongs to learning theories developed in the 20th century, and we're going to address these three and then a fourth learning theory that's really a new millennium learning theory. So let's start way back with behaviorism. So essentially, education rose out of psychology, and these disciplines were evolving in the early 20th century. So James Watson was an American psychologist who really gave rise to behaviorism. And this work is predicated on the well-known example of Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs, and the idea that through reward you can encourage behaviors to occur in your subjects. We see behaviorism really all over our educational system. The whole idea of a grade is the concept of performance and reward. Why do students take a test? Because they want to get a good grade. We're not intrinsically motivating them in any way. They just know how the system works and they try to behave in a way that results in positive outcomes within that system. So the one part that's kind of hard for us educators to wrap our minds around is the idea that behaviorism is not based on any mental power. It's based on behavior. How we respond to the stimuli is uncontrollable. A student does not want their professor to be unhappy with them. A student does not want to get a failing grade. And therefore, they behave in a certain way to achieve positive outcomes. They're not thinking about it when you're looking at it through a simply behavioristic lens. So then we move a little bit farther into the development of educational theory, and cognitivism came along. So it's important to take a moment to appreciate the rise in technology. So with almost everything in our modern world, technology drives innovation and understanding. So about the mid 20th century, we started to understand what was happening in the brain. We have equipment, scientific equipment like electron microscopes that allow us to understand how the brain works and when neurons are firing in different parts of our brain. Um, and the idea of cognitivism is that thinking impacts behaviors. It's not a behavior, it's something completely different. And cognition is the study of thinking, okay? Metacognition is the study of thinking about thinking, okay? This is going to be really important as we move through the webinar. Again, this is really not a systems concept. The idea is that the brain is one little chunk, the behavior is one little chunk, and they don't mean anything greater when they're put together. But we know that that's not true. Now moving, into about the 1960s, 70s, 80s, post-Sputnik science revolution in American education. Constructivism is the idea that knowledge is accumulated through life experiences, and self-reflection about those experiences gives rise to learning. Okay, and so the idea here now we're finally in a systems model where we're thinking about how learning arises, not only from the nuts and bolts of the classroom, but because of the people who are there and the experience of learning. And so this, for a long time, has risen as the primary way to characterize an adult learner, because an adult learner has a lot of experience. They have lived life, they've worked a lot. Unlike a child, we're not providing them with the primary experiences that they relate to when they're learning in the class. It's the other way around. The content of the course stimulates their memory and makes them remember about experiences they already had. So along with this, Siemens and George Siemens, I forget his co-author, I'll have to look that up, really developed connectivism, a new theory of learning in the digital age. So as I'm sure your mind is thinking, and we'll get there, the whole concept of a professor in the ivory tower and the mind of the professor holding all of the knowledge, and that knowledge being imparted verbally to the student cohort, is changing. The internet contains more information than any single mind. And especially in our online learning environment, what we really are trying to do is train our students to be able to use the internet to their maximum capacity. And we know that high quality information is available on the internet. So is low quality information. We need to figure out how we can impart this learning outcome of successful internet research. We want students to be able to use the internet like they were accessing their own brain's content. And so the idea here again is based on constructivism. We work in collaborative groups, like in discussion, but the sage on the stage concept doesn't work anymore. What you have in your mind is no longer the object of desire. Maybe students don't even care what you think about them. Millennials are well known for their, you know, rebuking of authority, as opposed to the rest of us who, really grew up in a world where, you look to your professors, you look to the mentors in your lives to train you to be a better human being. Now people are much more brazen and they feel much more self-confident. I will stop for just a moment to note that this concept of self-directedness, a low power distance between leaders and students, this is an American concept. So I'm making really broad generalizations that really apply to American students, but might not apply to students in other cultures. So let's take a look and summarize what we have been talking about. So in this graphic, we can see all four of the learning theories we just discussed. So in behaviorism, the learner is passive. There are external processes and reinforcement patterns that drive the learner towards the identity of good student, okay? And historically and today, the primary methods for behaviorism are lecture, drill and practice, rote learning, multiple choice tests. These all should sound really familiar. They are still, I'll let you know, alive and well. I started teaching at UCCS when we moved to Colorado Springs. And yeah, there's no getting around the lecture. I've interviewed several professors in the biology department, and they all say there is no other way but to lecture. Okay, so that should give you a really strong understanding of how behavioristic our educational system is in 2016. Now moving to the right, cognitivism, okay? This goes a little bit beyond the external environment, and there's internal processing, and we'll look at this in more depth when we're looking at some specific instructional design concepts. But essentially the idea is that we're training the brain, okay? We're not just eliciting behaviors, we are going through processes that we know create memory storage in the brain. So still lectures, but we get more into like multimodal learning. So the idea that you can deliver the content in both audio, visual, kinesthetic means, and every time a student interacts with materials in various ways, their knowledge becomes richer. They basically develop more neurons in their brain that link to those concepts that we're trying to teach them. Um, we still use multiple choice and essay assessment in cognitivism, but really here, the wisdom in the educational philosophy is how can I help my students remember? It's not just here's what they need to know. Now moving on to constructivism, the learner really builds on personal experience, and social learning is a huge part of it. So we see that all of our online courses are designed with discussions, and discussions are a great example of a constructivist construct for learning in the online environment. Students interact with each other and they then gain social skills, professional skills, academic skills, okay? We see some of the methods here on the left we don't engage in very often in CCC online master courses, but I think we're moving in this direction. So we, in the effort to create more authentic assessments, I think a lot of courses now have more writing components like essays on tests or research papers. And then, of course, we have labs in science classes, which are inquiry-based, discovery-based. I have not encountered any group work at CCCOnline, but I am trying to run a group work assignment in my anatomy and physiology course at Colorado Mountain College. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, the successes and failures. We do scaffold, so instead of didactic lectures, we tend to interact with what the students are interested in by responding to their original posts. So you have a broad discussion prompt. Maybe it's a discussion about GMOs, maybe it's based around learning outcomes, so it looks more like biotechnology, understanding biotechnology. But whatever the student writes in their initial post, we then respond to, and we provide that interaction on the student's level. Kinds of scaffolding that support constructivism, are the learning objects we're going to look at later. I've not also encountered any peer reviewing in a CCCOnline class, but I think we'll see this more as we get more into authentic assessments. But when you put students in the seat of leadership by saying, hey, what grade would you give this work product? That gives them a real sense of reality and assessment from the leadership perspective. Now, finally, connectivism. The idea here is that you simply present the learning outcomes and you let students achieve that learning on their own and as a social network. So again, we see discussions really are based on the concepts of connectivism. We give a concept, a discussion prompt, students go find information, they bring it back to the group, okay, and maybe Joe writes a response and I'm really interested in what he researched. So I'm just going to spontaneously be in a learning group with Joe because I'm going to respond to his discussion, he's going to respond back to me, okay? And then at the end, a discussion is really like a wiki. It's a knowledge base that was collaboratively developed. Now, I'll just stop here and say this is probably the most important slide, because this is what you want to share with your students. You want them to know why they're doing what you want them to do. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. But the idea is that tell students they're in a learning community. Tell them that the discussion is a wiki. Tell them that they need to have time on task. You cannot learn something by interacting with the materials once. This means that your dialogue with the students throughout the course shouldn't just be about the learning outcomes. It should be about all of these things. How do you train your mind? What are successful behaviors? How do you interact with people in a professional environment? And how do you use the internet to support your learning? Okay, so let's just take a deep breath and step back for a second and summarize what we've learned, okay? If you don't tell students what it is that you're expecting of them, they won't know, right? So you've got to share with them the behaviors you hope to see arise in them, okay? But also, your plan has to be aligned with their educational goals. So this means that you might teach classes that are have different instructional plans because there are different educational goals for the students. An example would be looking at Bloom's taxonomy and like 100 level courses versus 200 level courses. In a 100 level course, 4 majors, probably your primary educational goal is to lay a foundation. Students need to memorize information that they will use in their subsequent classes, okay? But as you increase 200, 300 level courses, you might have different educational goals related to the Bloom's taxonomy, like that you want students to have analytical powers and you want them to be able to critically analyze the material they're reading, not just accept it as what they need to know. You maybe want students to create work product. You want them to create a business plan. You want them to create a lab procedure, not just go through the procedure you know that they need to learn. Now, I'm going to say this over and over again. Don't be dogmatic. You can align your teaching philosophy to all these learning theories. When I first started in my PhD program, I kind of this was all new to me. I have an MS in biology and done biology research ever since. So getting a degree in education was something totally new and different, a completely new discipline. And I assume that most of you don't have formal training in education unless you teach in the education department. So when I was first introduced to constructivism and cognitivism and behaviorism, I was like, boo, behaviorism, yay, constructivism. I really feel well aligned to connectivism, but that idea that I had to be definition driven in my teaching philosophy, I evolved out of that. Is a time and a place for all of the things we've talked about: behavior, thinking, experience, and digital interaction. All 4 of those things are very important to our online teaching practice. So I, looking back at like teaching philosophies I wrote for jobs years ago, probably would be laughable at this point because they would say something like, I'm a constructive learner. I believe that inquiry-based learning is how teaching should be done in higher education. But the fact is, students have to take tests. I'm going to force them to take practice tests and do other behavioristic activities in my class because that too is also important. Um, and I use this quote from Stephen Jay Gould because he's a great example of someone who challenged the paradigm in the scientific world. He's most famous for the punctuated equilibrium theory, which is the idea that, evolution didn't occur in a slow march. There were stochasticity. There were specific events that occurred that created a lot of change. And then that led to stabilization over time. But we're not on this march towards stability, and a climax community and ecology is not the most diverse and stable community. It's not what we're looking for on the landscape. Okay, so now let's get into more of a discussion of practice. So how are educators using instructional design theory? Well, you might be saying to yourself, I don't use it. I get a master course and I teach with the master course. But I think most of us know that we have leadership skills beyond the master course. We probably teach at other colleges as well, where we are given more freedom to design our courses. But in the instance of CCCOnline, the strongest applications of ID theory exist in master courses. So a course develops at CCCOnline by instructional design and subject matter expert teams. And so the idea is that there are faculty members on the team who drive the content, like the organization of the content, the sequence of it, what kinds of activities would be appropriate, like labs, for example, in a science course. And then the instructional designer applies the systems theory so that students get behind the wheel of a CCCOnline course and they know what to expect. We don't want the vehicle to be different in every single course, because then students are not only having to learn what they need to know, they also have to learn how to get there, okay? My example here is when I was a TA in grad school, I used to get so annoyed because like every single time we had a lab, it was completely different. And so not only did I have to teach the students what it was I was supposed to be teaching them, I had to explain to them, this was before there were rubrics, I had to explain to them what it was that they would have to do to succeed in the assignment. And so you see there's two layers there. It's like, here's where we need to go, and here's how you drive the car. But with a master course, driving the car should be fairly stable activity. Every CCCOnline course has discussions. It has labs if you have a lab bearing course in science. It has writing assignments if you teach in the social sciences, which are like labs. There are formative assessments and summative assessments. There are going to be tests. You're not getting out of a class at CCCOnline without taking a test, okay? What you apply these structural components to depends on what course you're in, but the structural components are the same. In my own teaching experience, I find that my courses for Colorado Mountain College they have too much work in them. So for the last, like, I don't know, 4 years, I've been working to really reduce the workload. Every learning activity that I think would be engaging doesn't belong in one class. Okay, so I feel bad for my students who took my integrated science class several years ago because they were working their tails off. They were doing all sorts of exciting assignments, but at that time I hadn't learned this reflective lesson about don't change the vehicle. Okay, I just was like, this would be fun, this would be fun, this would be engaging, and it just gets a little out of control. So the master course is really a great way to design a solid vehicle, and Quality Matters is an organization that has really risen to evaluate this whole concept of the vehicle. And CCCOnline is working towards developing QM certification for their master courses. And I'm sure you're familiar with that. If you're not, just go to the Quality Matters website and you'll see there's rubrics with which these vehicles, the master courses, can be developed. Okay, let's look also at technology-mediated learning. So when we're learning in a scalable technology-mediated environment, more ID theory is applied because system design is central to the learning process. So an example I'll use here are electronic textbooks and the widget that's on the homepage. Okay, when we choose a textbook in 2016, we don't just think about what words are written in the textbook. We think about the digital technologies available, the adaptive learning availability through the textbook, and also just technically the nuts and bolts. Is there a widget? Will the electronic textbook fit into the Brightspace classroom appropriately? Okay. Um, so all of this is totally different to the origination of American higher education, the Oxford and Cambridge model, where you have an expert scholar who is leading students to knowledge through primarily verbal instruction. Now we know that the knowledge can come through technology. And what are we doing there in the classroom as professors? We're helping students to not only learn, but also to learn how to access the information and how to make it available to themselves through the technology that is available. So if you've designed a course, then you're likely familiar with the concept of the course map. So we touched on this a little bit when I was talking about driving the vehicle. Um, the course map basically lays out all the components of the course. You're doing this activity for this reason, to meet this learning outcome. You're doing this activity to meet this learning outcome. This activity appears in these units. So it's like a instruction manual for the course and how it's supposed to work. Okay, it shows the world what the learning experience is going to be like. My example here is a golf course. You know, if you don't have a map, you don't necessarily know how to get from one hole to the next. And it doesn't do you any good to just do the holes out of order. So if you're in a course and you don't go through the chapter 1, chapter 2 might not make any sense because, as we all know, learning is not a reductionist concept. It is a systems theory concept. Your knowledge is building as you build components into this greater knowledge base. And sequence is really important. That sequence is visible through the course map. Okay, another really important thing to keep in mind is that our learning environment in the online world is largely driven by a more massive trend in American education, and that is towards accountability. So I'm 36 years old. There are 40% more college students in America than there were when I was in college, and I went to college at the turn of the millennium, not that long ago. And so, with all of these students needing to learn, there has to be accountability. We can't really live in the expert scholar model anymore because it's not accountable, okay? The days when your professor just goes off on a tangent telling you about his research trip to Peru, it's over. Those days are over. We have to be driven by the learning outcomes. We have to have measurable results. And so instructional design provides accountable reasoning for course design. And it should demonstrate that there's a link between effective instruction and student retention and achievement. Okay, what we do has positive results. Okay, so in a way, that's still behavioristic, right? We do something, we expect a certain behavior to result. I put up this logo here for the park because if you have young children, you're likely aware of the park exam. So following Common Core and K-12, One of the new standardized tests that students have to take is the PARCC exam. And this is causing a giant uproar in the K-12 learning environment. And you should be aware of it because your students coming in are experiencing this. Uh, the PARCC exam is extremely difficult, and it is also delivered digitally. So from my perspective, it confounds the knowledge assessment with digital skills. But there's so many examples of adults, like a Harvard professor took the PARCC exam and only passed it with partial proficiency. I know an entire school district of fourth grade teachers who took the PARCC exam and couldn't pass it. They took it together. Okay, so accountability has to align with reality, but right now we're in the growing pains where we're actually probably really lucky that we live in the world of higher education because we don't have Common Core and our students don't have to take a national exam when they leave our guaranteed transfer courses. But we might be going there, okay? So this again is a reason why behaviorism is not dead, okay? Standardized testing is the wave right now in America. We are not going away from that. So post World War II, we really had the rise of constructivism and the idea of inquiry-based learning. But now we're in a world where we're kind of buckling back down. Drill and test, drill and test. That is what students are doing in the K-12, and that is essentially what we're doing to them in higher education. So I mentioned that there were 40% more students, college students in college than when I was in college. And this is a graphic put together, I think, by the Sloan C organization. And it's huge graphic. So this is the top half of it. But take a look. 1.4 billion students on Earth, okay? 65 million educators, 9 million faculty in higher ed, 56 million teachers in pre-K to high school. See, that's the one that really shocks me is who's teaching my children? Who is helping them to learn these things? How do you train 56 million people to be good teachers? That I do not know. There are 3.7 million full-time elementary and secondary school teachers in the United States. Okay. Just the numbers are just truly staggering. Here's the other half of the graphic. Okay. Take a look here. Technology is massively important to American professionalism. Okay. One of the saddest things I learned in my PhD program is this concept that America is a nation in decline. We used to be on top of the world, but we're losing our status as the pinnacle country in the world, primarily because our education system isn't working. We're not training people in the professional skills they need with the same kind of innovation and success that other countries are doing it. So how many college undergraduates are currently pursuing degrees in science or engineering? Look at America, less than 15%. We all know that science and engineering are heavily predicated on technology. This is why where we teach is so massively important to the success of our nation. Okay, we're gonna switch gears here, and we've kind of been talking theoretically, but let's talk a little more nuts and bolts about what's happening behind our courses and what kinds of things should we be talking to our students about in terms of relaying to them some of this wisdom in this webinar. Why are we doing what we're doing, and what can students do to improve their learning experience? So the ADDIE model, and You may have heard of this before, but the concept of backwards design is very popular today. And basically, the idea here is that you start with the course map, right? And you design the evaluations based on the learning outcomes for the course. Then you design the activities students would do uh, to meet those evaluative expectations. You develop the activities, you teach the class, you evaluate the students, and then you analyze the system to see if it's going to work. So this might not seem backwards to you at all. But the idea here is that the learning outcomes, which for us are designed in Colorado, we don't have Common Core. It's not like a national standard, but you have no say in the learning outcomes of your class unless you go to the 2-to-2 meeting once a year, and pretty much only the chairs and deans go to that meeting. But you have these learning outcomes. How are you going to get there? Well, first you got to figure out how you're going to test students to get and find out if they achieve the learning outcomes. Then you're going to circle back and design your class. So thinking back to one of the earlier slides where we were talking about intuition, we are not necessarily trained to understand this. We're driven to become teachers. We have an intuition about how learning occurs and what makes a successful classroom. But we can't start at the design stage of things. We have to start at the analysis stage. So in the ADDIE model, the role of the educator is to carry out the instructional design. And you might not be the subject matter expert for your class, so you might not be part of the design process. Just depends on what discipline you're in and whether or not you had a hand in developing the master course, which in turn is related to whether or not you worked at CCCOnline before your master course was developed. Online education is facilitated by the purposeful use of the ADDIE model for all the reasons we already discussed with the course map, etc. And in the ADDIE model, like we would identify all the media applications that we intended to use because they would be designed into the course and developed into the course. Okay, now let's move on to information processing theory. This is heavily predicated on cognitivism, so the idea that we're training the brain, okay? But there's also a heavy foundation in behaviorism. Any kind of procedural knowledge should be considered as behavioristic. So like, how do you take someone's blood pressure, for example? How do you write a business plan? These sorts of things. How do you speak in another language? These are procedures, and they're behavioristic, okay? But information processing also arises from brain biology. In order to deepen knowledge, the information needs to be held in the working memory long enough to transfer information into the long-term memory. This is probably the number one thing I talk to my students about beyond the learning outcomes. If you don't have time on task and you don't interact with the material repetitively, you will not remember it. This is scientific fact. So I'm constantly talking to my students about how, it's important to go into the discussion every single day for 5 minutes. That is more useful than to go to the discussion once a week. It is also more useful to study for 5 minutes a day than to cram for a test the day before the test and then hope that you'll remember all of that stuff. So with information processing theory, the educator stimulates the learner with discussion and learning activities, which increase this time where information can be processed. There are some great adaptive study resources developed by textbook publishers that drive this home. So I have recently implemented an adaptive study program in my anatomy and physiology class, and I'm doing it myself. and it's just has capabilities that I, as one human being, don't have. I cannot know what specific learning outcome each student is struggling with and what they already have under their belt. And I can't really know, for that matter, how to change my instruction to support the most number of students. The adaptive study program looks a lot like behaviorism. It's like testing and answering questions one by one, but it's formative. There's usually not a big penalty for not doing well during an adaptive study plan. But if you continue to answer questions incorrectly about a specific learning outcome, then the instructional materials driven towards that learning outcome are increased. So if I, for example, can't seem to explain the stages of meiosis when I'm going through the adaptive study program, I'm going to get more diagrams and I'm going to get more little instructional videos from the textbook publishing to support my learning in that area. Then I'm going to answer more questions. And when I have answered all the questions properly over and over again, I'm no longer going to see that stuff in my adaptive study program. It's going to go away. We're going to move on to new concepts. Okay? So I'm a big fan of these adaptive study resources. I know some people question like the idea of homework in higher education, but the fact is, if you are not helping students to learn how to process information, then they are not learning to their maximum capacity. And it doesn't matter if they're right in front of you in the classroom or they're on the other side of the computer. You can't really know where they stand in their learning in the same way that technology can know. I will just, I have young children, and this was in, let's see, first or second grade. My daughter, I asked her, what is learning? Okay. And this diagram on the right is what she explained to me. Well, there's a treasure chest in your mind, and it contains all of your memories. Okay. And when you take out a memory, you're playing with it, right? And then you put it back in the memory box. And the better you are at taking the memories out and putting them back in the box, the more you have learned. Okay? But notice importantly for constructivism and connectivism, environmental stimuli is very important. So every arrow here can be likened to a neuron. Every time you take something out of the treasure chest, you are developing more complex networks in your brain for remembering that. And our role as instructors should be to really get good at doing this. We want to be able to facilitate that neuron development in the brain by asking provocative questions in discussion, by offering different references of multimodal um, capacity like videos and still photos and conversation. And this way, if we talk about one learning outcome in many different ways, we've basically designed a web in our students' brains that helps them to learn. And you absolutely should talk to your students about this. You shouldn't just do it and let them wonder why on earth are you doing what you're doing. You should tell them about the treasure chest. Okay, now moving on, inquiry-based learning is, like I said, a post-Sputnik concept, but it is still alive and well in the sciences. And to my knowledge, CCCOnline courses are still being developed to the 5E model of instruction. This might not be 100% accurate information, but it's still a valid model with which to view our courses that we teach. So the 5E model arises from constructivism and cognitivism and inquiry-based learning. And the idea is that the educator, the guide on the side, is encouraging, engaging students and assessing them. And you're following this same pattern. It's that roadmap we've been talking about, where you first give students their first glimpse of the learning outcomes. You engage them. Engagement typically is, a lecture component, but in the modern digital world, it might be a video or some kind of graphic or even an outline of the concepts that will be learned in the unit. Then the students explore, so they study the material on their own. In a lab course, they do labs. In a social science course, maybe they write papers. But in the exploration phase, it's really a formative learning experience. Gain some experience with the learning experiences, the learning outcomes. Then students have to give back that information. And again, we're in a formative world, okay? They're explaining back to us what it is that they've learned. And this typically occurs in the discussion, right? The idea of the discussion is that you lay out the learning outcomes, students try their hand at explaining them, and then later on they'll be formally assessed with summative assessments to analyze whether or not they have achieved those learning outcomes. So explore and explain. Explore is really learning activities. Explain is discussion. Elaborate is oftentimes a writing assignment in a course. It might still be within the discussion forum, depending on how you how your course is designed. Then finally, at the end of all that back and forth, that interplay of bringing the information forward, putting it back in your brain, bringing it forward, you're evaluated. And the student typically takes a test for evaluation, right? Seems pretty intuitive to me, but I think it really gives a good explanation and illustration for how we process information. So if you want to learn more about all of this stuff, there's this great website called the instructionaldesigncentral.com. And you can just sit there with your coffee and read about literally dozens and dozens and dozens of models that are similar in many ways. Like I didn't actually talk about the first principles of instruction. I think that was noted in the webinar description, but it's heavily predicated on what we've already talked about. There's a lot of theorists who are really not bringing any new light to constructivism, cognitivism, and behaviorism. They're just explaining it in novel ways. Also, all of these different graphics, these are just different groups you can join for conversation about your professional practice. So what can you take home from this? When you're asked to write about a teaching philosophy, think about how your students learn, okay? Don't just think about yourself and what goals you have, right? Students learn in diverse ways, and students are more diverse than they were historically in America. And so we need to have room for a little bit of everything. We need to be able to bring multimodal learning into our classroom. We need to have hard lessons and soft lessons, formative and summative assessments. Okay? What is an instructional design philosophy? Think about what your students will have to learn and how they're going to demonstrate that learning. So going back to the ADDIE model, it's not just that they have to learn a specific concept. The fact is they're going to have to figure out how to relay that information back to the leader of the course, or back to their boss, or back to the surgeon that they worked for. There's no way around the assessment piece. And so the instructional model should really be driven by the assessment piece. And then let yourself believe in your intuition. Students go to school and it's an experience for them. It's not just something that they're doing because they have to do it. Adults are intrinsically motivated. If the experience is not a good one, they're going to have a hard time retaining in school and finishing to graduation. You want that experience to be valuable, comfortable, and effective. So really think about that. What are you doing to build that learning community in your class? These are slides you'll look at later if you want to do some more reading. Okay. And now I wanted to bring some learning objects to the table that we could discuss and figure out what are these examples of. Are they examples of behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism, etc.? So this one was given to me by one of the participants. Okay, so I'll read it. I am a strong supporter of experiential learning. This may include in individual or class projects, internships, and service learning. The strategic plan includes experiential learning opportunities. I have not found as many opportunities to engage students in experiential learning at CCCOnline because much of the curriculum is prepared in the shell. However, I have created D2L courses at CCD, and I often send my students out in the community to observe and report back. Here's an example. Discussion objectives. Define nonverbal communication. Recognize various nonverbal cues and their effect on customers. Explain the effect that gender has on communication. Describe the effect of culture on nonverbal communication. Identify unproductive behaviors. Use a variety of nonverbal communication strategies. Post an original response that answers the following. Visit a store of your choice. Tell the class what store and when you visited. In your most recent visit to a store or location where customer service is provided, what kinds of nonverbal behavior did you notice? Explain your thoughts and perceptions on this behavior. All right, so what do you guys think? Are the objectives aligned with the discussion prompt? Is the activity one that you could incorporate into a CCCOnline course even if you are teaching with a master course? Okay, let's move on. So here's learning object 2. This is something I designed, and again, I just, one, we're just going to laugh at me for the last few minutes of this webinar, but this is my favorite class, the second semester of integrated science. It goes through biology, earth science, geology, astronomy. It's a course for teaching majors, okay? And this is an example of experience or writing. So if students can't go on the walk, they can just write an essay. But essentially, they're going to go walk down the road and they're going to note when they get to each of the planets, when they get to Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, etc., and understand the relative distance of these planets based on how far they have to walk. Okay, it's a long walk. um, if they've actually gone through the experience, I feel like 97% confident that they're not going to forget. I don't need them to write me some excessive essay. I just need them to provide evidence that they went on the walk. So the idea here, of course, is strongly focused on constructivism. This is a lesson in my CMC course. What I'm kind of chuckling about is this instructional panel that I made. I spent a whole semester making these for all of the activities and all the discussions in my course, only to find that it doesn't work for a number of reasons. I can't change anything about the panel once I publish it in the course without pulling it out, going back to the PowerPoint, saving it as a JPEG again. So although it looks beautiful, I think that it's really not worth the effort it took to make it because it's static. It doesn't have adaptive qualities. The other problem is that we went through all that ADA training over the holidays, and this it cannot be read by a screen reader. And so that is a problem for diverse learners. This is a JPEG file, and the screen reader cannot read a JPEG file. So I won't be doing this again. All right, next one. So I mentioned that I had been trying to enact group work in a class, in an A&P class, and it has been a rocky road. I have tons of scaffolding in the assignment. Like the first case study, they have a non-graded discussion where they're supposed to communicate with each other, like in the public forum, so that I know that they're communicating with each other. And then I can answer any questions if they're going astray. The case studies come from this national case study research organization. They are designed for teaching. They have good questions that can be parsed out among the group members. But the number one problem I'm having is that the groups have a hard time sticking together. Uh, so instead of having 3 case studies throughout the semester, I think that I've finally convinced myself that I should just have 1 case study, and it should be scaffolded in a different way. So the stakes are too high for the students to rely on each other. It's a 60-point assignment. And so if one person flails, then everyone else is punished by it. I have read in the literature that one way to facilitate group work is to couple it with um, self-evaluation. So if they have to fill out the rubric based on their own performance and the performance of their group members, then they won't be penalized when someone in their group is non-communicative or does a subpar job writing or whatever the case may be. So group work, again, an example of collaborative, constructive learning. By scaffolding and having an assignment like this come back up to meet the student several times in the semester, like with draft writing, that is part of information processing and cognitivism. And then, of course, there's the behavioristic realm of how do I behave in a professional group? How do I perform to the standards of the group and show respect to my group members, communicate with them in professional ways for a successful outcome. So I do feel like group work has great outcomes. I just haven't figured out how to do it perfectly myself. And then the last learning object we'll consider is technology-based didactic instruction. So I'm teaching at UCCS and I teach a lab course, and the lab course is not connected to the lecture. So for the first half of the course, this is my first semester teaching it, I didn't lecture at all in lab because I knew that 99% of the students were in lecture. But now the lab work is coming before the lecture hits those learning outcomes. I don't have time to lecture in the class. They have to do the hands-on experience in the class period time. So I started to make instructional videos. They haven't been viewed very often by the students despite all the work I've put into them. What I want to say about this though is that instructional videos are helpful. The students who watch them think they're great. It's getting students to watch them. So that goes back to the whole concept of how are you going to communicate with your students and let them know what the expectations are and what behaviors they should enact for success. The other thing I'll note is that this is strengthening my own knowledge. So the time it takes to make a PowerPoint and then record it, like I'm doing right now with this webinar, basically is the most valuable learning experience I can have as an instructor. I know more about these segmented worms than I ever would have learned if I didn't make the instructional videos. So as you think about strengthening your own knowledge and your own craft as an educator, there's a lot to be said for the process of making an instructional video. You have to figure out what the learning outcomes are, figure out how you're going to display the information, what you're going to say in what sequence, and then report back. It basically follows the ADDIE model. The other reason why instructional videos are so helpful to you in your professional environment is that it's ready proof that you know what you're doing. So as you apply for various jobs, and we're all adjuncts, right? So we're always looking for more work. Having instructional videos is something that is very helpful for your CV and your own personal professional development. So I know I covered tons of stuff, and I hope that you have time to interact with the PowerPoint later, just to consider what we've learned here, pull that information back out of the memory chest, think about how you're going to use it in your classrooms. And I'm always here to answer questions. You can email me or call me anytime, and I'd be happy to chat with you or send me your learning outcomes. Or your learning objects, and we can talk about them afterwards. I think we're going to have a discussion in the CCCOnline community in D2L, where we can continue this and maybe pull in more people who didn't attend this webinar but watched it as a recorded version later. Okay, thank you for your time.